My name is Myra Spencer. I'm 36 years old, and I've worked at 3 a.m. sewing clothes for strangers without clapping. A year after my divorce, I was finishing my shift near the maternity ward when I saw my ex-mother-in-law in the elevator. Carol Bishop was smiling like a doorbell. She came right up to me on Sunday, so happy and so loud the nurses could hear her. "My son was the best decision you ever made," she said. "Now he has a son with your best friend." I was labeled devastated for 6 whole years in one sentence. I didn't look at her, I just stared at her, the silence like a melody, and said, "Can you believe this?" 5 minutes later, someone neither she nor my best friend expected walked in through that door. A name no one wants to write will be read out immediately in court. Welcome to a quiet drama of women facing brutality, a reality that never ends, but isn't inevitable. If you're a fan of quiet justice, tune in. Leave a comment and let me know where you're listening, and don't forget to subscribe. Let me rewind about 5 minutes, because the smile was coming from the man's face. It was a Thursday, near the end of a 12-hour shift, and I was handing a card to a night nurse named Theo. The maternity ward was at the end of the corridor, leading to the emergency room where I worked, and I had passed it hundreds of times without giving it a second thought. Carol was there to ask me. Of course she was. Paige had given birth 3 weeks earlier, and the entire Bishop neighborhood in town was filled with balloons and jars. I knew it. I'd prepared myself for it, but I hadn't prepared for Carol to come to me, as if she'd been waiting all afternoon. She looked me up and down, taking in my clothes and my tired eyes, then lifted her chin. Then she repeated the phrase she had said before about her daughter, her young child, and my best friend. Theo walked quietly beside me. A passing assistant slowed her pace, and I felt my thumb brush against my grandfather's delicate gold watch on my wrist. I pressed the screen, as I had done since childhood, waiting for something I could not yet change. I didn't raise my voice. I learned long ago that the loudest person in a room rarely tells the truth. "Do you believe that?" I asked him again, this time slowly. Carol closed her eyes, enveloped in silence. She had expected tears or anger, or at least shock, but she didn't understand anything that was happening. Somewhere down that corridor, 2 automatic doors swung open, though I hadn't turned around to see yet. I didn't know who was coming, but I knew what had started all this. Before things get any clearer, here's something you should know about me. I grew up in a farming town in southern Ohio, the kind of place where everyone's work was everyone else's goal. My mother cleaned the house, my father drove a food truck until his back ached. I worked 2 jobs during college and 2 more during medical school, and I learned to stay humble and let my work speak for itself. This has been my philosophy for most of my life. When I do my job well in silence, the truth speaks for itself. People see your true self clearly. I think some people happily believe that. This was helpful to me when I was in the hospital in a difficult situation where you don't panic and can't justify yourself. You fix what's in front of you and move on to the next situation. The smell of the place, the smell of clean cotton and disinfectant that fills everything in the hospital, comforts me every time I enter. This meant I was in a place where I felt comfortable, a place where no one had ever told me I was flawed. I could use a code, splint my shoulder, and persuade a frightened child to start sewing, all without my heart pounding. But that same instinct, which caused me so much anxiety, had a dark side. I bore it all alone. I didn't ask for help. When people started telling me lies, I had made the worst mistake a quiet woman could make. I thought silence would be enough. The only place where no one dared call me a whore was the hospital. The rest of my life was a different story. When I turned 28, I married Mark Bishop. He possessed a charm that made strangers feel special. He remembered names. He shook hands with everyone as if they were shaking his. Half the neighborhood attested to this, and in the early years, they supported him. We longed to have children. We tried for a long time, but to no avail. Unhappiness was present in our home like a stranger. About 2 years later, I did what any doctor would do. I suggested we run some tests. Simple blood work and a basic examination, the kind I always recommend to my patients. Mark refused. At first, he laughed, then he was shocked. He said that Episcopal priests didn't have such problems. He summed it up with a short talk about faith and how we should trust in God. I pushed him once. I pushed him twice. Then I let him go, because I didn't want to bring a grown man into the clinic, and I believe that silence is a form of patience. I went and had the tests done. My results came back completely normal. I remember sitting in my car in the clinic parking lot, reading the newspaper, feeling both relieved and confused at the same time. What if it wasn't me? I couldn't find answers. I couldn't force myself to. The longer I was without her, the easier it became for those around me to write their own stories. At that moment, Mark began to say things, quiet things, first to his mother. Maybe the problem was with me. Maybe I simply couldn't. I hadn't realized the power of silence when the right person chose to keep that lie. Carol Bishop led her church's ladies' club with the same fervor she had used to lead the general election campaign. She buried her young husband and raised Mark alone, a testament to the fact that her son hadn't let her down during those difficult years. He was perfect because he had to be. Otherwise, what was the point of all this sacrifice? When Mark whispered that I might be the problem, Carol didn't hesitate for a moment. She picked him up and ran. He started as a tiny seed, a sigh of pity after the stew, a hand on someone's arm, a faint voice. Poor Mark. He loved children so much. Then she had her teeth pulled. At a church dinner that autumn, she introduced me to the wife of a visiting minister with her usual expression of sympathy. "This is Myra, my son's wife," she said. "She's a doctor, you know. I feel so sorry for the children." The woman nodded sadly, as if she knew what I was saying, and I realized then that the whole story I'd been told had crumbled before my eyes. I stood there in my formal dress, holding a paper plate, and Carol waved her hand as if I needed comforting. Then she said something she'd wanted to say for years, something she said others would pray for. Some women just don't know how to do that. She smiled as she said it. She believed it. That was the worst part. She wasn't being mean. She repeated what her son had told her clearly and confidently, avoiding any discussion of the details, unaware that his words were lies. I didn't tell Mark anything on the way home that night. I should have told him, but I was waiting for the truth to come out. Paige Dolan had been my best friend since we were 15. We met in high school chemistry class and watched everything unfold from afar. We shared my college days, her long career, and moved between 2 states. Our relationship spanned 12 years. She was the one I called when my father passed away. She stood at my wedding in a green dress and wept as I recited my vows. When church sermons began to affect me, she was the one I turned to. She would come and leave me with a glass of wine, and she always knew what to say. Or so I thought. Looking back, every word of comfort she gave me was different. "Mira, you're very talented. Maybe this isn't your path. Mark will love you. Don't let his mother get in your way. You don't have to be a child to be a complete child." Kind words, all of them, but they always cause the same pain. They always remind me of something I missed. At the time, I didn't realize how often her eyes were darting towards Mark across the room, or how she was beginning to know his intentions that I hadn't told her about. I was too busy being grateful for someone who seemed not to judge me. She would sit on my living room sofa and tell me I deserved better than her, and I would shake my head in denial. I never imagined she would enter my life. People like Paige don't take what's yours all at once. They take it gradually until one day you discover they are exactly who you thought they were. I believed him completely. That was the second mistake I'd ever made. Mark filed for divorce on Tuesday. When I got home from work, I found a handmade envelope on the kitchen table and an empty cupboard. He hadn't even waited to tell me. Over the weekend, he'd moved into Paige's apartment across town, and that was that. History for me. The story being told was harsh and cruel. Myra was cold and distant. Myra was dedicated to her work. Myra couldn't bear him children, and a person needs a family, doesn't everyone? Carol made her presence felt, and Paige, my own Paige, didn't correct me at all. The 2 people who had known me for a long time had warned me, and I hadn't argued, because I felt I was doing my duty to the fullest. I didn't post a single word online. I didn't call anyone to defend myself. The next morning, I went to work and treated a little boy's broken arm, telling him he'd be okay, and he was. And I felt like that was the only real thing I'd done all week. If you've ever lied to yourself just to keep the peace, or keep your family together, or keep your friendships, or keep the reputation you've built over the years, you know exactly what that feels like. It tastes like blood, and you're not allowed to spit it out. Stay here with me because I'm beginning to understand something. The peace I cherished so much wasn't mine. Someone lied to me about myself. They were the ones who needed my silence. If you had been there, you would have spoken the truth, and the silence wouldn't have lasted, because it wouldn't have lasted. I want to tell you the story of the day the hospital board taught me that it's okay to speak up. It's not about my marriage anymore, it's about the day I was admitted to the hospital. I'd been a candidate for the emergency room job for years. I'd developed trauma protocols that are now used by half the county's population. The job was just as important as my own, and everyone knew it. Then the rumors reached the accreditation committee. There was no truth to them, not a single grain of truth, just the appearance of it. Dr. Spencer's personal life was unstable, and there were questions about her judgment. Had you heard about the divorce? What was her husband's family saying? One of the board members, who played golf with Uncle Mark, started asking direct questions about my ability to lead under pressure. I wish I hadn't sat there for 10 years while people bled at my desk. When the job was advertised, someone with half my time and no protocol contacted me. He told me I was a strong candidate. He said the decision was difficult. He didn't tell me exactly why, but I grew up in a small town. I recognized the sound of a sentence veiled in gratitude. Something inside me changed that night. Her lies about my body cost me my marriage, and I left her because I thought her patience was the right thing to do. But now, that lie had reached a point where I wouldn't let anyone touch me. My job, my name, who I've become. Just as I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot, and just as I had sat in my usual office years before, I realized that the silence I had prided myself on had paid off, and that someone else was quietly paying the price. The nurse I trusted gave me the name of a lawyer named Ruth Calloway. Ruth's office was above a hardware store. She wore reading glasses perched on her gray hair, and her gaze suggested she was 3 steps ahead of you. I told her everything: the marriage, the church talk, the counseling, the job I lost. Lawyers rarely do that. When I finished, she put her pen down. "What you're describing could be defamation," she said. "It could be a lie, but I'm not lying to you. It's serious." She made it perfectly clear. To win, we have to prove 3 things. First, that a specific false statement was made. Second, that it spread among others. And third, that it caused real and measurable harm. The harm, the number of lost advances, the number of lost wages, is the easy part, she said. I sat there, fastening my grandfather's watch to my wrist. What about the lies? Ruth looked at me over her glasses. That's the part you have to be prepared to face publicly. They say the accusations are true. They say you can't have children. To win, you have to be prepared to prove otherwise. I felt a knot in my stomach because I couldn't prove it. My tests came back normal, but normal results don't determine who's responsible for the silence. They only indicate that it's not my fault. I was about to get up and leave, feeling as though I were inviting the city to examine me. Then Ruth said something I needed to hear. "Mira, silence isn't a virtue when you're being fired. Sometimes the best thing you can do for yourself is let them prove their point." I didn't react immediately, but I didn't leave either. I thought about it for 2 weeks. I'm not indifferent. I make decisions slowly, as if I'm reading a sign, and then I decide everything at once. I wrote down everything I was missing, the church community I grew up in, and my situation in a city that already assumed the worst. From the way people spoke to me, they described me as bitter and cold, and as a woman who held a grudge against her ex-husband's family. I knew exactly how this story would end because they had already written most of it. But I wrote the following article: my name, my job, the truth. And the simple truth is that I did nothing wrong, yet I am being punished for it. I kept going back to something. I didn't do it to hurt Mark. If I had wanted to hurt him, I would have had a whole year to do it. I made it clear to the hospital board that the next time my name was mentioned in a room I wasn't in, I would stop believing a false story. That was the line I drew, and I drew it intentionally. It's not revenge. Revenge is an overwhelming, unquenchable feeling. The truth is that someone, somewhere important, has finally decided to keep other people's false promises. I called Ruth before work on Monday morning. I told her I was there. She said, "Okay." Then, swear an oath. I hung up, went into the emergency room, and had the quietest day of the year. The decision itself seemed to be peaceful. Ruth prepared the complaint over the next few weeks. She listed specific statements, dates, and witnesses she had heard from. She detailed the loss of the promotion, the salary change, and the damage to my professional reputation. It was strange to read. All the silent humiliation I'd endured had been orchestrated and calculated, then transformed into something significant. When the news arrived, it spread through the city faster than any ambulance I'd ever driven. Myra Spencer is suing the bishops. Carol was very clever. She told the ladies' club that I was spiteful and malicious, and that the bitterness of my empty house had hardened me. I repeated every word she said, even without realizing it, which was exactly what Ruth had hoped I would do. Mark remained silent at first, as did Paige. But then I started receiving messages. Some were cruel, some were curious, some were quietly supportive, and some were from women whose names had been rewritten by people who claimed to love them. One of them said, "Well, they did the same thing to my sister." I didn't respond to either of them. I went to work and continued to handle the case at the pace of the law, that is, slowly. Ruth told me the next step was for the other party to respond. How Mark's lawyer chose to defend his position would determine everything. She said, "They have two choices. Either they say the comments are just hurtful and baseless. That option is unpleasant, but it suits them." Then she tapped her pen on the table. "Or they raise their flag and say those statements are true. You are the one truly responsible." I pray for whoever chooses that path. "Why?" she asked. The woman smiled, already knowing the answer. "Because then they'll have to check. They'll have to open the door to check." They chose the second option. Of course they did. Mark's lawyer gave an answer that solidified Ruth's position exactly as she had hoped. Their defense, in plain Afrikaans, was that the words spoken about me were true, not slander. I was the reason the marriage failed. They claimed in the letter that the mistake was medical, and it was my fault. When Ruth called to tell me, I heard a hint of joy in her quiet voice. She said, "They only spoke the magic words. The truth is the defense." But that's what they didn't think of. I let her out for a moment. To prove the claim, to prove your infertility, they would have had to present your medical images to the court, and I'm not exaggerating. Reproductive records are highly confidential, and the judge doesn't hand them over easily. We need to convince the court that this is serious and frightening, but you swore under oath that you were the cause. You can't file this lawsuit and then let anyone see it. It's a loophole. It's not easy. It's a loophole. I can work on closing that loophole. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. What does this mean? It means they increased Mark's fertility, Ruth said. He had been hiding with her for years. He could have given us cause to question it under oath in court. There's no guarantee, but it's the best chance we've ever had. For 6 years, I was the one whose body was the subject of conversation at various dinners and prayer meetings. By trying to make it public, by trying to win the case by speaking publicly in court, the bishops did something none of them wanted to do. He opened the door to find Mark. I thought about how he had ignored temptations years ago, in that heated exchange, and how the subject always drew attention to him whenever it came up. I hadn't said anything to Ruth yet, but I felt a thread I had buried long ago stirring back to life. I couldn't sleep that night. Then I did what I always do when something bad happens. I looked slowly and carefully at the timeline in my mind, as if I were reading an old map of what had saved me the first time. And there, 7 years earlier, On the morning of his wedding, Mark was driving into town for a routine medical checkup. He wasn't there all day. He returned home with an uncharacteristic quietness and humility and poured me a drink before dinner. He never did that on weekdays. I asked him if everything was all right. He told me the doctor was a quack and the whole trip a waste of time, then quickly changed the subject and left. And here's the part that made me stare at the ceiling. After that day, he never mentioned having it re-examined again. Not once. At least in front of the town, he pretended to take the matter seriously. After that, the whole thing was dropped, and within a few weeks, the first whispers about me began. At the time, I ignored it, just as one ignores the emptiness of one's era. I didn't connect it to anything because I didn't want to lie. No one controls who they love. But now, with Ruth's words still ringing in my ears, that quiet day in the city seemed to me like a moment of truth, not just a pointless outing. I had no proof. I wanted an explanation for what had happened. I had bad memories and feelings, things that don't count in court. But that was enough for Ruth to point the finger at me, and that's what she did the next morning. Ruth listened to my story about the trip to the city without writing it down, which meant she was listening very carefully. When I finished, she paused for a moment. Then she said, "It's not serious in itself. It's just a reminder of bad feelings, but it's a reason to ask the right questions." She then explained what had happened, because the other party had raised the issue of my fertility and claimed that I, not him, was the cause. Ruth was able to request the court to produce the relevant medical records for Mark. She said, "If he wants to say it's you, the law allows me to ask him if it is. That's how it works. You can't leave the door half open." I filed the lawsuit the following week. Mark's lawyer defended him vigorously, and that's when I realized I'd hit the nail on the head because nobody defends anything so fiercely. They argued about privacy, about propriety, about anything that would close the case. A trial date was set, and I was forced to endure the ignorance, which is torture in itself for someone like me. I'm used to requesting tests and receiving the results, but this was different. It was like asking for permission to meet with a judge. I sat in my shift, reading the scanned images, trying not to think about a file I'd never seen before in the city clinic's archives. Ruth advised me to be patient. "The courts are deliberately slow," she said. "It gives the truth time to stop being frightening." I wasn't afraid of the truth. I was never afraid of the truth itself, but rather that they would find a way to hide it from me. Before the judge ruled on the request, Ruth made me sign an affidavit detailing everything. Every statement, every date, every witness who had testified under oath. She placed small, thick, colored cards on the table between us, showing every instance where my name had been mentioned. She said, "Read everything, and then sign only what you know to be true." So I read it. Every single line. The vicar's wife's cooking, the exact words Carol had spoken at the church dinner, the words some of the women had said about not being prepared for this, the board meeting, my lost wages. Reading years of silence in poetry had a profound effect on me. The lie made the truth seem flimsy. I picked up the pen Ruth had given me and noticed the smell of the room. It wasn't the clean, disinfectant-y smell of a hospital, but the smell of paper, paint, and dust from the hardware store downstairs. For years, that hospital smell had meant safety, the only place where no one had ever called me isolated. Now I'm here, in a completely different place. I had to travel to space to get there, and I can no longer hide. I pressed the pen against the line. As I wrote, the delicate gold watch slipped coldly across my hand, and I remembered my grandmother, who always said that patience isn't about waiting, but about knowing when to wait. That was the defining moment. My signature came out clear and precise, the most permanent signature I'd had in a year. When I lifted the pen, it was all over. The complaint was confirmed. The petition was now in effect. Everything that had been in the city file and the device used to access it was now working, and I had started it all. Ruth gathered the pages and carefully placed them on the table. "We're waiting for the judge now," she said. I nodded. For the first time, the wait wasn't a burden, but a powerful motivator. The verdict came on a gloomy afternoon, in the middle of a quiet shift. Ruth called me, and I went to the pantry, my heart pounding in a way I'd never experienced before at work. She said, "The judge agreed, but only to a limited extent." She guided me carefully, explaining everything. Since the defense had stated that the infertility was mine, the court ruled that, according to the judge, Mark's fertility records could be obtained reasonably. It's not automatic, and it's not a court order. The records are released under a protective order, reviewed first by lawyers and the court, and used only when necessary. "This isn't a court order for anything," Ruth said cautiously. "I thought so." "Then I won't have to destroy anything," I said. "No," Paula said. "You have to file the case, file the report, and wait. And you have 3 different offices, each one coming at its own time." I looked at the file. Everything was clean and organized, but it was old. It looked like a preoperative kit. I didn't have to search my house. I wanted the court, the jury, and the forum to knock on the same door. Better yet, on the same day. And I knew exactly which day it would be. Kyle came to the motel that night. He stood in the parking lot, looking about 10 years older than my husband. He told me the truth, finally, in every detail. Because there was nowhere to hide. His contracting company had gone bankrupt 18 months earlier. He used credit cards and a second line of credit, hoping to get rid of the debt without my knowledge. The debt kept piling up. Now he owes me nearly $60,000 that he hasn't told me about. He used the word insult 3 times. He said his wife outshone him, that he cheated on her, and that he killed his mother because my mother rented a 2-bedroom house on the highway, and that my money bought my parents a house on the beach. When his mother and Dustin paid the rent, it felt like money was thrown to a drowning man. He'd used it to pay off his debts. I saw him clearly the moment I stood in that square, and I felt sorry for him. A proud man drowning in silence, too ashamed to ask for help. That moment was real. I want them to know I gave him the money from the bottom of my heart. Then, because of what he said later, it was all over. He didn't ask how my parents were. Walter didn't tell Joan he'd apologized. "So you're letting her go?" she said. "Leave my mother alone. Serena belongs to the couple anyway. Half of her is mine." He didn't give up. He contacted my parents to take them with him, calling it just a party. I had asked Paula beforehand about the specific rules, as I didn't want to delve into matters I didn't understand. The house was registered in my name, meaning that Kyle's mother, not Kyle himself, would decide the house's fate at that time. Marriage, however, was a separate matter, one for a divorce judge to decide, not for someone making decisions in a parking lot. I would have prepared the answer in that room. I had the purchase price in my account, the down payment, and the savings that came before it, every dollar I had available. It's basically mine. Oregon couldn't afford a house like that, and any dispute would end up in a judge's court. No persuasive question would be asked in a hotel parking lot. I looked at the man I had loved for 9 years. "I'm sorry about the debt," I said. "It's over. I delivered the newspapers this afternoon." He wanted me to buy his forgiveness, and he got it. But he wouldn't accept my silence. 2 days later, Paula's case officer personally delivered the notices to every adult living in my house. I wasn't there. That's how things are done properly. But I heard what happened. Brenda picked up her copy, read the headline, and then tore it in half right in front of the hostess. "Don't kick your mother-in-law out," she said, as if it were some unwritten rule. The hostess, who delivered the letters to the most unpleasant people, kept a watchful eye on the time and left the torn halves at her feet, because the offer was either to pick up the newspaper or decorate it with the clippings. Dustin laughed and said the place was booked for the whole month, so it didn't matter. Marilyn called me a word I won't repeat. Neither of them moved a single suitcase. That was the part I'd prepared, the most important part. They thought the announcement was a threat, a hoax, an angry woman waving a sign. They saw it as a bargaining chip they were waiting for, and I always left because I was desperate, because I'd been feeding things for 20 years. They had years of documented evidence proving Serena's eviction. All they had was the deed, the court date, and the local tax code, which neither of them had read. The announcement wasn't a threat. In election campaigns, it's called the first strike. You release it so everyone sees your position. Then, you reveal everything behind it. They told me outright that they would force me to take the hard way. Fine. The hard way has rules, and I've read them all. So I opened 3 fronts at once. Each one was legal, each one was slow, and each one aimed at the same goal on Saturday. The first was to summon the other party to appear before the federal court in Lincoln County. The court clerk provided us with a way to get a hearing date and then a signed order to remove the person who still refused to leave. Second, I filed a complaint with the county's law enforcement department regarding the unlicensed short-term rental of a property in a residential area. All advertisements, photos, and booking schedules were posted. Third, I reported the property to the booking platform itself, which was listed by someone other than the owner, and sent them a copy of the lease in my name, as their rules prohibit anyone other than the owner from renting out a property against the current owner's wishes. 3 desks, 3 work schedules, and this was the room I'd been eagerly anticipating. My parents' 50th birthday party was on Saturday, the day we'd planned for all year, the reason I'd come home, the day my whole family would be standing on either side of that balcony. I could have changed the date, but I didn't. It wasn't about getting revenge on Brenda later. I saved Saturday because everyone who needed to see the truth was in the same place at the same time. Family, neighbors, even the guests Dustin had booked. You don't get a second chance like that. If I had wanted to make it public, I would have done it carefully in front of everyone once. I wrote the date in my notebook and crossed it out. 3 days ago. Brenda never rests. She did what people like her always do when the newspaper arrives. She caused a scene in her family. She was on the phone for 2 days. Her story is good. I agree. Poor Brenda, who left her husband abroad for years and has now returned to throw his 62-year-old mother-in-law out onto the street, after being evicted by her mother-in-law, a cruel soldier's wife. I told my grandchildren. I told Kyle's story. I told the neighbors on the beach that no one knew, and some of them accepted it. I received some cautious texts from family members, asking if I had to be so harsh, if there was no way to be kind. 2 months ago, those messages broke me. Driven by an overwhelming sense of responsibility, I began to control, calm, and reassure everyone while my parents slept in the barn. But I learned a crucial lesson from Paula. You can't argue with history. You have to let the truth speak for itself, even if it's officially documented. So I didn't defend myself. I didn't send long letters. I wrote a reply to a family member who asked if there was a better way. Come on Saturday and be alert. Brenda was there telling the story. Let her be. Her version is stored in phone calls and will disappear within a week. Mine is stored in the judge's office, in the courtroom, and on a document bearing a name. This version never wears out, and I don't need anyone's approval. He'll convince me on Saturday. A rather eccentric friend of mine turned up, and Dustin gave me the copy himself. Carol, a teacher from Boise who was staying at my home and was there with her husband to celebrate their anniversary, received an automated message from the booking site. This notification prompted me to file a report stating that the property was under review due to a guest ownership dispute. Carol, a diligent woman who paid $2,000, did some research and found my name and the Nova family name next door in the county public property records. I discovered that she was living in a rented house to people who didn't own it, so I did what good people do. She contacted me through the forum and wrote, "I think we're in the middle of something. We don't want to be part of taking over your house. Tell us what's right and we'll do it." I called her. She was furious, very upset. She and her husband weren't going to leave early. Paula said, "Let them finish their stay. Guests have rights, and an empty house is of no use to anyone." But Carol said something that changed everything on Saturday. "We're looking forward to the weekend," she said. "If someone stands here and says loudly that we rented this room from someone named Dustin, then we'll talk." Dustin sold a room to a stranger for a quick profit, and the stranger volunteered to be a witness. The man's greed led him to place another man in the corner of the room. The booking window was moved on Friday. They checked the title, and the rules were simple, even if families made them complicated. They couldn't rent a house they didn't own as long as the landlord had the title and objected in writing. They retrieved the title, and that was that. Not only that, but they canceled Dustin's future reservations, the green wall of reservation Brenda had been so proud of, and froze payments on the account until the dispute was resolved. I know exactly when this happened thanks to what I overheard on Dustin's phone. Cancellation messages came in fast, one after another, each one sent to a guest, and a few $100s were refunded. Then each one was abandoned. Dustin had set up that calendar like a slot machine with a single payout. On Friday afternoon, someone pressed a button, and the machine started distributing money to other people. At first, he didn't understand. He thought it was a mistake. He spent an hour on the phone with technical support before someone explained the ownership dispute and the unauthorized listing, and he finally realized that half of the money he had spent hadn't arrived and that he had to return the money he had received. My husband drank from the money pipe he'd been using to pay off his secret debt that afternoon, without making a sound or breaking any rules. They submitted 2 documents, the acceptance letter and the report. The third, the one from the court, was on its way. This whole thing wouldn't be over until Saturday. County law enforcement posted the notice prominently on my front door Friday night. A savvy official had stopped an unlicensed short-term rental company and attached a notice to the property operator regarding unpaid temporary occupancy taxes. Now 2 notices have arrived at my home for all the residents of the neighborhood to read. But my pregnancy with her since that Friday is illegal. Father. That night, I returned to the hotel and sat with him while my mother was bathing. He shook my hand, then reached into his pocket and took out the brass bells that had been wrapped in a piece of cloth since the day he had taken them off. He handed it to me. I kept it in a safe place just in case, he said. Then quietly, he asked, "Shall we take it back, Bog, home?" And I did something I hadn't done with that coin in 20 years. I took the Unity test coin, the copper disc I'd held in my hand during those difficult days abroad, out of my pocket and placed it in my father's trembling palm, his fingers interlaced around it. I said, "Wait until Saturday. It's useful in difficult situations. It's never embarrassed me." He looked at me as if I were made of gold, which I was. My mother came out and looked at the 2 of us with the bells and coins between us, and said, "You're always so quiet, my dear." And my father said, "I absolutely hate you." I had no answer to that. Some things just happen as they are meant to. Saturday, 50 years, and accountability. Friday night, Paula and I discussed the plan one last time, and the plan was essentially no plan, and that kind of plan is difficult to implement. She warned me, "You want a dialogue? Don't. The newspaper is more powerful than you. Leave it. Speak in the lowest voice. Let them be the ones who can't stand it." We opened the file on Saturday and recorded it. The Federal Reserve hearing was held, scheduled, and ordered to continue. The district notice was posted on the door. The list was canceled and the payment stopped. Every detail was accurate and recorded, and now it's all out of my control. No one can call what I did an act of anger because it's not like me. I did something that would work whether I shouted or whispered, so I shouted softly. The last thing I did Friday night was get my uniform ready. Not to scare Brendan, though I know what would happen if I did that in a crowded square. I explained it to myself. Because on Saturday, when that woman who called my mother a whore in front of 50 people yelled at me, I knew that every part of my story would force me to scream again, finally unleashing 20 years of pent-up resentment. And while everyone was waiting for me to break down, I had to look down and remember who I was. I was the one standing there, not working. That was all. I went to bed early. I slept soundly. Across the courtyard in a clean room overlooking the water, my parents were asleep in their beds, and in that room, a copper coin lay on the bedside table, waiting for breakfast like the others. It was a bright and fresh Saturday morning, and my mother began to dream about that day on the beach when I was 9 years old. I drove my parents home at noon. The truck behind me was carrying their things because I wanted them to unload them for dinner. The park was packed. There were family members on both sides, folding chairs, a refrigerator, potato salad, and children running around in the street. Brenda had also thrown a party for my parents' 50th birthday. She greets people at my house, accepting compliments on her lovely spot on the beach, a glass of wine in her hand, a municipal notice plastered on the door, about a meter behind her. She seems determined to ignore and disappear. Marilyn turns on the refrigerator. Dustin is hidden on the phone, pale-faced, still arguing with the theater about the frozen funds. Teacher Carola and her husband sat quietly on the steps of the porch where she told me they lived. My parents stood by the bakery, unsure whether they were guests or criminals on their birthday. I put on my school uniform and went out onto the gravel, leisurely. I felt the garden watching me, just as it watched me. The conversation began to fade, so I turned around, my feet sinking into the silence. Brenda was at her aunt's performance, so I saw her one last time. When she returned, half the group was silent, looking at me and then at her. I didn't say a word. I went to my mother, kissed her on the cheek, and stood beside her. Then I poured a glass of water from the table and waited. Silence does its thing. It makes everyone hear. Brenda couldn't stand silence, and people like her never could. Silence is the one thing they have no control over. She took her wine and her hearing and crossed the courtyard, choosing an activity that had always worked for me. The crowd was noisy enough for 50 people. Smiling at the throng, she said, "So, is the mayor going to ruin her parents' party? Is he going to make a scene in front of everyone?" Everyone turned to look at me, including the family members who had been waiting for Brendan to come home for 2 days, half of whom were expecting this cold, unfeeling woman to arrive after her phone call. I placed the glass of water on the table. Reaching for the file under my arm, I took out the documents and arranged them one by one on the table with the potato salad, so anyone could bend down and read them. The document's title was simply my name. Court document, printed in Lincoln County. The strike list and the boycott of the area, one of them a double list, were pasted on the door behind her. The notice on the pavement indicated that the list was canceled due to a property dispute. I didn't take it down. I just set it aside like letters. Then Brendan stood there motionless, her refusal hanging in the air, and, as I told the hundreds of shocked soldiers, she was short, broad, and friendly. "Brenda, I'm not making a fuss. I shouldn't." A moment of silence. I'm silent. "This must be bothering you. You can hear the wind coming off the water stirring the empty corner where the bells hang." Brenda's eyes moved to the papers on the table, and for the first time since she'd come from here, for the first time in this long month, she read the name on the deed. Her smile didn't vanish suddenly. It vanished completely. Brenda did what people in corners do. She raised her voice to muffle the water droplet. "This is my family's house!" she shouted, or rather, the water came rushing down, causing several family members to back away. "We did it! We tried! We did it!" She let her run for a few seconds because a crowded square watching a quiet woman next to a loud one was a judgment in itself. Then I traced the deed on my finger along the required line, turned it over for my relatives to see, and made a loud enough noise to keep it with me. "This house is deeded. It belongs to Kyle. It belongs to Voss. It belongs to me. I bought it for my mom and dad for 10 years' rent. I saw it and turned the line over. What she gave me on the balcony was entirely mine. You were right, Brenda. Someone is leaving today. Read the name on the agreement and leave before 5. She opened her mouth, and Paula's voice came from the crowd, dry and calm, identifying herself as a lawyer and assuring anyone who needed a legal document that a notice and an eviction order were on their way, and that the process was proceeding without the need for a short-term rental permit. Then Carol rose from the porch steps, and after the teacher had left, she said to everyone in the yard, "My husband and I paid $2,000 to stay in this house this week. We didn't know he wasn't the one renting it." All eyes turned to Dustin. He was still pale, clutching his phone. He chose not to render it useless to them, since it displayed nothing but a column of cancellation messages. The county notice was on the door. The deed was on the table. The lawyer, the witness, the brother who owned nothing. Brenda had no version of events. Even the relatives she contacted seemed understanding of what she had done. Brenda still had one card. He interrupted me on the balcony, and that was all he did. He composed himself and said in front of everyone, "You weren't one of us." He wanted to hurt me as he had hurt me before, but everyone in the courtyard saw the truth revealed in the file, and the conversation ended in complete silence. I felt its weight then. I didn't raise my voice. I said, "You're right, I'm not one of you. Let others be gentle with me, because gentleness here has dire consequences. I'm in charge." Then I did what Paula had taught me. Separate responsibility from anger. I stopped talking about feelings and focused on the simple, measurable results, so no one would confuse resentment with anger. Here's what will happen today. You must leave before 5 p.m., otherwise the order issued by me will be enforced by the council, and I am not responsible for its enforcement. The rent freeze will remain in effect and will include any outstanding bills and property taxes owed to Dustin. If anyone else fails to comply, the council fine will increase daily, including the fine registered in Dustin's name. Dustin spoke softly. I told Brenda, if you had asked me for help, like relatives do, I would have helped you. I always have. But you didn't ask. You took my mother and put her in the barn. Brenda looked for the cupboard but couldn't find it. Marilyn went over to the cars, and then Brenda sat, sadly and softly, on my mother's lovely porch chair, the one she had been using all month. She sat there as upright as she could, then jumped up as if she wanted to burn him, because she finally realized that sitting still wasn't in her nature. They left shortly before 5 p.m. Dustin left first, and that said it all. He had calculated the taxes and fines owed in his name, and within an hour he was out of the place that had been used as a gambling den. Marilyn followed her without saying a word to anyone. The singer, who had been her support, had no one else to lean on. Brenda took a long time. She wandered around the house, gathering her things slowly, as if performing a small ritual, waiting for someone to stop her, comfort her, or return her belongings, I think. But no one did. As I walked toward the car, she passed me, head held high, tears welling in her eyes, and she didn't apologize. Not for me, not for my mom, not for my dad. I don't need an apology. He should apologize to him, not to them. Kyle? Kyle stood in the middle of the yard between his mom's car and his parents' car, trying to be a part of both, and in the end, he chose not to move at all. He had a whole month to stand on the porch and say, "This is wrong." He took advantage of them, to say the least. When his mother's car arrived, he was still there, the man in the middle, no one else. I walked past him to the front door and reached out and pulled out the card that someone had stuck on the door to welcome the next group of guests. Welcome to Harlan Cove Beach Resort. I tore everything apart and threw the two pieces onto the porch planks. The house was quiet, very quiet this time. Not the bold quiet of the first day, the good quiet. The kind of quiet that comes over a house when only the right people are there. We unloaded the truck before dinner, just like I had promised myself. My mother entered the large kitchen, her kitchen, which she had been instructed to keep out of the guest's sight, and stood in the middle. She turned slowly and took measurements. Then she took a cloth and a bottle from under the sink and began wiping the surrounding walls. Within an hour, the scent of lemon oil was once again wafting from the entire kitchen floor, carefully. All the scents of my childhood lingered throughout the house, a whiteness that smelled of strangers. My father carefully took the kitchen towel and carried it to the porch, then untied the brass wind chimes and hung them on their hooks. The wind rose from the water and fell upon them. My mother listened from behind the curtain and closed her eyes, just like she did on the rope when I was 9, just like I'd thought about it for a year. Then Dad held out the test coin to me, the copper disc he'd kept since Friday. I clasped my hands again, this time forever. Take it, Dad, it's yours now, take the rope, like always. He didn't argue. He took it, looked at the water, and said the bells were still there. Yes. Finally, the scent of my mother filled the house, and I heard my father's voice. And there was no number hanging on the door. There was only one thing left to solve. And this was the hardest part, because it wasn't a stranger. This is the man I married. Kyle and I talked the next morning on the cliff far from home. He took the blame again, just like he does when people are drowning, leading them into the water. He said he was desperate, and he said he loved me. Above all, we could have worked this out, couldn't we, as a family, and I want to tell you the truth because I've always been honest. I liked it, and part of me longed for the easy part, the safe landing. I swallowed it too, because I was good at swallowing things, but I saw the price of swallowing. I saw him sleeping in the barn. So I lowered my voice on that rock in the yard and waited. Kyle, I apologize for the debt. It's your debt, and I'll help you find someone to settle it with. just like anyone else. You've forgiven me, but your family put my mother in a storage room and rented out her room at night. When I objected, you told me to stop. So I'm going to sue. The house belongs to my parents. The debt is yours, and that's the end of it between us. I prefer them to him. I told him I didn't want my parents to lose their home, and that both were possible at the same time. I could love him without paying that price. He had no answer. No answer. Some boundaries aren't punishment. They're simply the shape of a line that should have been drawn years ago. Sometimes I think about that covered cardboard box and how my parents tried to make guests feel comfortable putting it in the pantry, and I'm starting to believe it. Loving someone doesn't mean handing them the keys to everything you've built. Sometimes the kindest, most thoughtful thing you can do is write your name on the document and leave it there. This is my story. A house I bought with 10 years savings, a plane ticket for foreigners, and a cottage for my parents. And a title deed in my name, mine alone. If this clear boundary reminds you that this is an act of love, not war, consider it a sign for you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment, hit the subscribe button, and see you in the next episode.